Abril Perez Sagaon was born in 1971 in Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico. Her mother, Maria del Socorro Sagaon, worked hard to give Abril and her two other children, Javier and Ani, the best possible education and to provide them with a life of security. Abril showed a talent for entrepreneurship and learning from a very young age. Her main goal was to obtain a higher education and achieve economic independence in order to lead a comfortable life. Growing up, Abril developed into a disciplined, intelligent, and bright woman. At the same time, she was a kind and compassionate person who always tried to help others. Her outgoing personality and leadership skills led her to become an example to her friends and a true professional in her field. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Nuevo León and a master's degree in business from the Science and Technology Institute of Monterrey. In time, she found her calling in the world of digital sales and quickly advanced in this field, managing to take an important executive position in the Bilbao Vizcaya Bank of America in the early 1990s. At that moment, when she was at the peak of her career, she met Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez. Born on November 11, 1968, Juan Sanchez was an ambitious entrepreneur. It turned out that the two had a lot in common. Juan Carlos graduated with honors in economics from the Science and Technology Institute of Monterrey, the same institution where Abril studied. In addition, Juan was also educated at prestigious universities in the United States, such as the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. Given his education and field of work, the man described himself as a passionate entrepreneur in e-commerce and financial technology. Juan and Abril socialized with the same circle of people and often participated in the same projects together, and at some point they realized that they loved each other. After several years of their relationship, they decided to get married and had their wedding in 1994. Together they were successful in several projects, such as the online stores Pagamóvil and PlazaVIP.com. They also participated in the creation of the De Compras store, which in 1999 became one of Mexico's leading e-commerce pages. The couple's life seemed to be a real dream come true. They were both successful in their careers and were happy to live and work with each other. They became even happier in 2001 when their first daughter was born, whom they named Ana Cecilia. 2 years later, they had their second child, a boy they named Juan Carlos Jr. In 2005, they had their second son, whom they named Julio Andrés. Despite the fact that Abril was a very busy woman and had many work commitments, she always managed to be present in the lives of her children. She herself was involved in their upbringing, cared for them, met any of their needs, attended their school plays and assemblies. Abril's entourage admired her, and many said she was the perfect mother. In fact, many also thought Juan Carlos was an excellent father. They were a model family, and everyone wished they could be in their shoes. However, it was really just a cover. At the time, the family was going through a bad time, and everyone in the family suffered from Juan's explosive temper. He was an angry and hot-tempered man who could unleash his anger on anyone he could get his hands on. At first, it started with verbal abuse. Juan made Abril feel uncomfortable, said terrible things to her, and of course, this offended her. Over time, the situation escalated, and the man began to resort to physical violence. He began to beat Abril regularly. The woman always tried to hide it from her friends and family, saying that she wanted the best for her children, and knew that by being with Juan Carlos, they would have the best possible future. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to provide for her children on her own, so she didn't leave her husband. However, by 2009, things had gotten so bad that people around her began to speculate about the family's situation. Abril's friends and family began to notice her depressed state and bruises on her body, but in response to questions and entreaties for divorce, she adamantly replied that she would stick by her family. By 2014, Juan Carlos had reached incredible heights in his career, and that same year, he was appointed as one of the most important people in Amazon's commerce in Mexico. A year later, due to Juan's new position as Amazon's Director of Operations in Mexico, the family had to move to Mexico City. During the move, Abril thought that a change of scenery could solve their problems, but unfortunately it didn't. The man continued to insult and beat her almost every day. At the same time, Juan Carlos was quite careful. In front of people, he behaved like a loving husband and father. He always took care of his reputation and didn't want it to be ruined. He often wrote posts on his social networks about how Abril was the love of his life, although at the same time, he constantly followed her, accused her of cheating, and even hired a private detective to try to find something suspicious in her actions. While his marriage was crumbling before his eyes, the man's career was only flourishing. He landed an important position as Director of Digital Commerce at Electra, a multinational service company specializing in commerce and finance services. By 2018, the tension between him and Abril had become unbearable. Although she tried to do everything she could to keep her family together, after a trip they took to Monterey to celebrate the Christmas holidays with her family, she realized she could no longer stay with her husband. The fact is that during that trip, Juan, in a fit of another gratuitous rage, grabbed Abril by the neck and tried to strangle her. He did it after he accused her of infidelity again. A private investigator had sent him a picture of Abril with a male colleague. But of course, nothing had happened between them, and it was just a random shot. Juan, on the other hand, was convinced that the man was definitely his wife's lover. Already after this accusation, Abril decided not to answer anything to him and to file for divorce. But she was finally convinced of her choice on January 4th, 2019. At that time, they had already separated and were planning to tell their children that they were going to get a divorce. It all happened in the early morning hours. Abril was sleeping and woke up to a blow to the head. At first, she thought that part of the ceiling had collapsed on her, but when she was able to focus her vision, she saw that it was the work of Juan. It turned out that the man had hit her in the head with a baseball bat while she was asleep. Abril immediately tried to fight back and flee the room, but she was unsuccessful, at which point she screamed. At the woman's scream, her eldest son, who was 16 years old at the time, came running in. He immediately realized what was happening and stopped his father from taking his mother's life. He took her away, and together they fled the house to go to the hospital. Because of her injuries, Abril needed emergency treatment. After everything happened, while his wife and son were in the hospital, Juan wrote and published several posts on his social media accounts. In the posts, he claimed that Abril cheated on him, stole money from him, and 26 years of his life during their marriage. On top of that, he wrote that Abril stabbed him in the chest with a knife. He attached photos of the knife and pools of blood to the post. In response to his posts, one of his friends recorded a video asking him to spread the word. All these posts were very strange, but Juan went even further and wrote a post about Abril taking his life and published it from his own account. Why he did it is still a mystery, because it was clear that he was fine, unlike Abril, who had to spend a few days in the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Abril immediately filed a police report against her husband. The authorities granted the woman custody of her 2 children. The fact is that her eldest daughter was of age at the time and could manage herself. However, she also chose to stay with her mother. Juan Carlos was ordered to pay child support in the amount of 6,000 Mexican pesos monthly, which is equivalent to about $350. In fact, such an amount was not enough to cover the cost of raising 2 minor children. Despite her new financial difficulties and her fear of her husband, Abril decided to face the new phase of her life with optimism and did not allow herself to be discouraged for the sake of her children. Abril then moved with her children to Monterey, where she followed the lawsuit against Juan Carlos and where she finalized the divorce. Her traumatic experience and the constant abuse she suffered prompted her to rethink her life. Thus, she joined a Christian group dedicated to protecting families and began working as a divorce counselor. In the future, she intended to start an organization that would help women who, like herself, had been abused. Through such an organization, Abril herself was able to heal and even forgive her ex-husband. While Abril tried to rebuild her life, the lawsuit against Juan Carlos continued. Only 9 months after the attack, namely on September 20th, the authorities filed a criminal case against him on charges of attempted feminicide. The case was brought to court, and the supervising judge, Federico Mosco, assigned the man an informal pre-trial detention. Thus, Juan Carlos was taken to the northern prison and was held there for several weeks. He appealed the decisions, and on November 3, 2019, the same judge who had heard the case before reclassified the crime. Consequently, another judge, Hector Jimenez, filed a motion to reconsider the sentence. Neither Abril's photo from the hospital nor the testimony of her and her son were enough to convince the authorities to send Juan to jail. Moreover, the judge said he did not believe that Juan Carlos committed the attack with the intent to take Abril's life. The judge stated that if he did act with that intent, he would have succeeded because she was asleep and helpless at the time. According to the judge, Juan would then have used the full force of his blow and would have done his best to take Abril's life, and he regarded the baseball bat as a toy, not a weapon. Because of this, the case could no longer be treated as feminicide, and so the remand was canceled. There were only a few more hearings left in the case, the outcome of which was becoming uncertain. Abril was shocked by this, and her friends and family began to feel disappointed and angry with her. In desperation, she wrote a letter to the judge saying that she feared the man would take her life, but her plea went unanswered, and Juan Carlos remained free. Once out of prison, the man began fighting for custody of his 2 minor children. All of this forced Abril to travel from Monterrey to Mexico City to attend all the hearings. She also had to take her children to various psychological tests because Juan claimed in his lawsuit that she had turned the children against him and that this was why they so easily agreed to leave and never see him again. A week before the hearing, the woman gathered her 3 children and gave them an admonition. She wished them to fulfill all their dreams and to find the strength to forgive, perhaps referring to their father. This conversation was an omen that something bad was about to happen. Perhaps the woman had a premonition of this and wanted to make sure her children knew one last time how much she loved them. Following her ex-husband's demands to avoid legal problems that could separate her from her children, Abril arrived in Mexico City for a meeting scheduled for November 25, 2019. On the same day, ironically, thousands of women took to the streets to mark the International Day Against Gender Violence, and 48-year-old Abril was shot dead in the south of the Mexican capital. That day after the court hearing, Abril left with her children and their lawyer in a car. She asked her legal representative to drive them to the airport because they needed to board a flight to Monterrey, as they were about to return home because they had done everything that was required of them. On their way to the airport, they stopped at a red traffic light, and at that moment a motorcyclist pulled up alongside them. It turned out that the motorcycle was driven by an assassin who shot Abril twice in the head while she was in the car. By some miracle, her children were not hurt. They were in the back seat of the car, and one of them was lying down, so the bullet only slightly hit him. Abril didn't die right away. They had time to get her to the hospital, where medics did everything they could to save her life. Unfortunately, she was unable to cope with her injuries and died 6 hours later in the hospital. The legal representative contacted the woman's relatives and informed them of what had happened, and immediately her brother Javier traveled to Mexico City to deal with everything. Everyone was convinced that Juan Carlos had something to do with it. However, the authorities were of a different opinion. They said that because they didn't know who the shooter was and what his intentions were, they wouldn't be able to classify the case as feminicide and arrest Juan. That's why the case was labeled as a simple murder, and the police were going to investigate and gather all the evidence they could to prove that the case could be considered a feminicide. A friend of Abril spoke about the situation on her social networks. In her post, she directly accused Juan Carlos, but such a statement only led to the deletion of her account. For their part, the woman's relatives were very afraid that this man would go unpunished for what he had done. They tried to draw public attention to the case through social media as well, and the fact that Abril died on a day that celebrated the fight against gender-based violence gave her death a different meaning. The family organized many protests and marches in support of Abril, in which they demanded justice. People on social media supported them and began to actively discuss the fact that Abril had repeatedly spoken of her fear and that the authorities had simply ignored all her attempts to save herself. In the midst of grief and feelings of disappointment, Abril's family and friends held her funeral in Monterrey, holding a requiem mass at the Benito Flores Chapel. During the event, dozens of people who came to offer their condolences to the family and honor Abril's memory also spoke out to demand justice. The funeral procession then traveled to Pantheon Garden in Los Angeles, where the burial of the body took place. Abril's case has drawn attention to all gender violence cases, but especially those in which judges let go, free some men who attacked women but failed to take their lives. Abril's ex-husband, Juan Carlos, was released from prison after appeals were filed and did everything he could to get the woman to Mexico City, where there was nothing to stop him from taking her life. Mexico's Attorney General's office opened an investigation against judges Carlos Trujillo Rodriguez and Federico Mosco Gonzalez, as well as against Judge Hector Jimenez Lopez, whose rulings allowed Juan Carlos to be released from prison. Representatives of then Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's party called in the Chamber of Deputies for the removal of Judge Mosco, who had already been involved in another controversial decision in which he decided to release a doctor accused of abusing a patient in a public hospital. That time, the judge dismissed the article on violence against women, so the accused was only charged with sexual assault and released. Against the background of the scandal associated with the Abril case, on November 29th, the president of the Supreme Court of Mexico City, Rafael Guerra, decided to suspend all judges involved in the case of Juan Carlos. In this regard, Mexico City's head of government, Claudia Sheinbaum, said that they would investigate Abril's case as a feminicide, adding that the judges could be held responsible for her death if it was proven that Juan Carlos was the perpetrator of the crime. Local and international media that covered the case reported that despite the evidence against the businessman, the judiciary released him. In the midst of the legal proceedings, the family announced the creation of a nonprofit organization called Abril's Voice to provide information, psychological, and legal assistance to various victims of violence. Demonstrations held in the wake of Abril's death prompted the Metropolitan Prosecutor's Office to request that the trial against Juan Carlos be reclassified so that he could be prosecuted for attempted murder of women, which could lead to a second temporary imprisonment. Following the charges against him, the man released a statement on his social media account saying that the crime against Abril must be solved and that the perpetrators must be punished. He added that he was ready to cooperate with the investigation and that despite the conflicts in their marriage, he would never wish her such a tragic end. These publications have caused discontent among users and the community at large. His 18-year-old daughter, Ana Cecilia, publicly accused the man of the physical and psychological abuse he subjected Abril and the children to over the years. She attached photos of Abril from the hospital after the attack with a baseball bat to the accusation post. According to the girl, her father was a narcissist and a sociopath who was only released from prison for paying off the authorities. A few days later, through investigations and protests, an arrest warrant was issued for Juan Carlos, but not because of the Abril case, but because he had violated court obligations. He was released on the condition that he come to sign in every week, but he didn't. He also missed 2 court hearings, so Judge Agustin Moreno Gaspar overturned the release order. At one of these hearings, which the man missed, the judge read a letter in which he claimed he feared for his life and therefore did not want to attend. Juan added that since Abril's death, he and his close family and friends had received death threats, and he believed that if he showed up at the hearing, someone would try to carry out an act of revenge. In the letter, he said that he had not committed the crime and his conscience was clear. The judge apparently did not accept this statement, and that is why he issued an arrest warrant. During the hearing, Juan was also restricted from leaving the country. At the same time, the investigation into the Abril case continued. The authorities were now determined to find out the whole truth. In the course of the investigation, a letter written by Juan to the authorities was leaked to the media, in which he again denied any involvement in Abril's death and claimed that he had never wished her harm and that he had never tried to kill her. He even revealed what he believes happened that morning when he attacked Abril with a bat. According to him, he and Abril had gotten into a fight during the night, and she was the first to pick up a knife and stab him in the side. He stated that the moment he hit her with the bat was the first time he had resisted, and noted that he had never tried to take her life. Apparently, this letter caused a lot of resentment among the people who came to hear it. Besides the fact that no one believed what he said, the investigation found that everything pointed to Juan Carlos being the prime suspect in the case. The investigation also found that at least 7 other people were involved in the crime against Abril. They came to this conclusion after reviewing surveillance footage in the vicinity of the location where the events took place. The footage shows 2 cars going after the woman as soon as she came out of the courthouse. Both drivers of the cars were in communication with the hitman who fired the fatal shot. According to video footage, after the attack was carried out, the hitman and the 2 cars fled to a medics colony in Mexico City. Although by that time, the identities of the pursuers and the hitman had not yet been established, the investigation indicated that Juan Carlos may indeed have been involved in the crime. The investigation speculated that Juan had met the men during his incarceration in prison, and that he had paid one of them for protection during that time. Investigators speculated that the men who protected him got out of prison and then Juan himself was released, and that the man then paid them to take Abril's life. In addition, only Juan knew the exact route of Abril's movements in Mexico City, as he was the one who requested the meetings and court sessions. When these details became known, no law firm was willing to work as the man's defense. Also, Abril's family, friends, and co-workers provided law enforcement with all the information they could to assist in his apprehension. However, a few days later, sources in the country's Attorney General's office said that it was learned that Juan had left Mexico. They commented that he was able to escape by crossing the border between Mexico and the United States, and that he was now in the United States. Mexican authorities quickly contacted Interpol to spread the word that Juan Carlos was wanted, and Interpol did indeed do so. Soon the man was wanted by authorities in over 151 countries, and they wanted to find him at all costs. The Abril case progressed very slowly. Only a few months later, the first arrests were made. Mexico's Secretary General of Security, Omar Garcia Harfuch, made a statement and revealed that 2 people who were involved in the events were arrested on March 5, 2020. He noted that all those involved have been identified and all 7 are under investigation. The detainees were Juan Carlos Rodriguez Ortiz and Rodolfo Daniel Bandera Sandoval, aka Chango Leon. The former was identified as the driver of the vehicle that served as a wall during the events, while the latter was identified as the person who fired the shots. Both were arraigned as suspects. After the 2 arrests made, Abril's relatives called on the authorities to detain Juan Carlos because he was the organizer of the crime. As for the judges who released him after attacking Abril with a bat, they returned to work on May 7 of that year. But public protests were so strong that the Judicial Council suspended them again. 7 months after the first 2 arrests on October 28th, authorities apprehended 2 more criminals. The new detainees were named Oscar, alias El Oso, and Alejandro, alias El Carnal. El Carnal was arrested along with his 33-year-old mistress named Magda Carina, whose bag was found to contain 3 bags of illegal substances. A firearms magazine, a long gun, and a weighing scale for weighing substances were also found in the couple's possession. As for 46-year-old El Oso, 182 doses of cocaine were found in his possession during the arrest, which was made at his home. Also seized were 300 rounds of large-caliber ammunition, a firearm, and 9 bags of illicit substances. Both detainees belonged to a gang led by a man named Juan Carlos Maldonado, aka Juan Balta, who was also arrested a little later. At the time, Juan Balta was considered the leader of one of the most dangerous gangs in Mexico City. He was found in possession of a large amount of illegal substances, and his gang was generally involved in the distribution of these substances. According to court records, Juan Balta was in prison at the same time as Juan Carlos, and this is where they met. According to informants, Juan Balta offered him his protection in exchange for money, and when he got out of prison, he was still receiving financial assistance from this man. It is believed that Juan Carlos asked Juan Balta to find 2 men who would be willing to take the life of his ex-wife. The investigation was in full swing, and the authorities wanted to prosecute him, but were unaware of his whereabouts. On March 19, 2021, the judge's decision about the January 2019 violence against Abril was overturned, and the case was reclassified as attempted murder of a woman. This decision came after the woman's relatives and the prosecutor's office filed a series of petitions for judicial review. 2 months later, on May 23rd, the remaining perpetrators, which included 3 women and 1 man involved in the murder of Abril, were arrested. As a result of the investigation, the judge issued 3 search warrants and 8 arrest warrants, according to a joint statement from the Ministry of Civil Security. In the first search, Amado Vicente Rodriguez, 48, was arrested and a short-barreled firearm, 2 magazines, 73 serviceable cartridges, 9 cell phones, 53 watches of different makes and models, jewelry, computers, cash, fake passports, ID cards, driver's licenses, phone chips, and a plastic bag of illegal substances were found on him. The second search was conducted at the Jardines de Morelos colony. There, 34-year-old Mabel Montiel Moreno was arrested, and at another location, 48-year-old Graciela Alicia Flores Valdez was arrested. Cell phones were seized from both women. The most recent detention was at Florida Mayor Alvaro Obregon's colony in Mexico City, where 50-year-old Aisha Jalil Castillo, known as Aguera or Alvar's godmother, was arrested. At that point, 9 gang members were apprehended, 7 of whom were believed to be involved in the Abril case. The only one who could not be caught was Juan Carlos, so the authorities re-advertised him. Attorney General Ernestina Godoy explained that the first announcement was for attempted feminicide, and the new one was issued for the taking of a woman's life. However, despite all search efforts, months went by and Juan could not be located. While the search for him continued, Rodolfo, also known as El Changoleon, contacted the authorities. When questioned, he said that he was actually the man who pulled the trigger that took Abril's life. He eventually pleaded guilty and said that he did it because Juan Carlos promised to pay him $10,000 to do it. He said that Juan contacted him from prison while he was still in pre-trial detention. Over the phone, the man gave him Abril's address where she was living while in Mexico City, ordered him to start following her, and issued instructions on how he was to commit the crime. Juan also told him that he would be able to obtain weapons in Monterrey. El Changoleon said that he left Mexico City for Monterrey expecting the weapons, but days went by and no one ever contacted him. He returned to his home in Mexico City and heard nothing about Juan Carlos until his release from prison. When he was released, he contacted El Changoleon again and told him that his plans had changed. He now wanted Abril to be deprived of her life in Mexico City, since he had succeeded in getting her to come there herself. The lawyer for Abril's family was present at the interrogation, and he asked El Changoleon if he had anything to say to the victim's family. He then said that he repented for the crime he had committed and apologized to his brothers and sons. For his part, Juan Carlos Rodriguez Ortiz said he received 5,000 Mexican pesos, about $300, from Juan Carlos, even before explaining the crime he was about to commit. Because the Metropolitan Court system did not allow the cases to be consolidated, the case was split into several hearings. In the first trial, only the perpetrators of the crime, Rodolfo Daniel Banderas and Juan Carlos Rodriguez, were indicted, with the remaining defendants to be tried in subsequent proceedings. The first trial sessions began in August 2022, during which the prosecutor's office heard 28 witness testimonies and presented 14 pieces of expert evidence. During the trial of Rodolfo, known by the alias El Changoleon, he described how he planned and committed the crime and pleaded guilty, as he had done previously. On May 19, 2023, the trial court found Rodolfo Daniel Banderas and Juan Carlos Rodriguez guilty and sentenced them to 52 years in prison for committing feminicide. They were also ordered to pay 560,000 Mexican pesos, about $30,200 in restitution. After the trial was completed, both were transferred to the Oriente Detention Center for Men, where they were to serve their sentences. Abril's family announced that they would appeal the conviction against Rodolfo, as they considered it insufficient since he was the one who fired the shots that took Abril's life. As for the other defendants, it has been revealed that in October 2014, the judge decided to split the trials of 4 defendants: Juan Carlos Maldonado, aka Juan Balta, Alejandro El Carnal, Amado Vicente Rodriguez, and Graciela Alicia Flores. This decision was appealed because prosecutors believed that such a decision would not only delay the trial, but that it would also impose excessive costs on the court, since each of the defendants had to testify in court at least 3 times. There is no new sentencing information as of the end of January 2024. It has been 4 years since Abril took her life, but the true perpetrators of the crime have not been punished. The woman's children now live with their uncles on the outskirts of Mexico City and hope that justice will be served. To this day, everyone wonders where Juan Carlos is, and his capture is still the responsibility of the authorities. Abril's relatives have stated that they will continue to fight for justice until the man is arrested and convicted.